Today, let's talk about the endocrine system, which is chapter 17. So, if you remember from last semester talking about the nervous system, there was a pathway we talked about, and that pathway started with a stimulus. That stimulus was received by a receptor, a sensory receptor, and then that information was taken down a pathway called the afferent pathway or sensory pathway. Okay. That information was then taken to an integrator. And that integrator, if you remember, is the control center, the brain or the spinal cord. Then that information was taken down another pathway called the efferent pathway or motor pathway, which is then finally processed at an effector. That effector could be a muscle cell or it could be just another neuron. And then it causes some sort of action. Okay, so this should be fairly familiar to you. And this whole input that is going sort of around in a circle was checked by what we call negative feedback. Okay, you also talked about positive feedback. It sort of says, hey, the stimulus has done enough. We don't need any more of it. Positive feedback, remember, had a little bit different look on a graph. So the negative feedback kept things within normal limits, helped to maintain homeostasis. And in a way, positive feedback does the same, but it has a little bit of a different action. So if this was a graph, here, let me pick another color here. It'll give me a good eraser on this. So if this is a graph, then this would be negative feedback, maintaining a balance between certain parameters. I'd pick another color here, and we had the line going up this way, or maybe going down instead of up. That would be positive feedback. And there's a good example in the human body of positive feedback, which is birth. The uterus is sensing something there and stretches, and that stretch causes a release of a hormone called oxytocin. And that oxytocin just keeps getting released every time the uterus stretches until finally we have some sort of climatic event, which is birth. Okay, so what does this all have to do with the endocrine system? This little pathway here we're really familiar with when talking about the nervous system, but how is that related to the endocrine system? And I want you to keep that in mind as we move forward. All right, so let's compare and contrast what we know about the endocrine system. I'll make a little graph here, and this side will be endocrine, and then this side will be the nervous system. Okay. So when these systems receive a message, that message in the endocrine system, if you remember, is a hormone. Okay. And that hormone is a chemical message. All right. And that hormone, it's important to note, is dumped into the blood. Okay. But what about the nervous system? What is its message? Well, we have an electrical message, which we call the action potential. So that's electrical. And if you're picturing a neuron in your head right now, that message is received and taken down the axon, taken down the axon towards the axon terminal, and then will cause a release of a neurotransmitter, which is actually a chemical message. A good example of this would be acetylcholine. All right. So we've talked about the message. Now, what about the target? The target in the endocrine system is basically anyone who has a receptor for that message. So anyone, okay, anyone with the right receptor. Now, how is that different than the nervous system? If you're picturing that neuron in your brain right now, that neuron, if you remember, has to touch. And I'll put that in quotations. It has to touch. Touch what? Touch the effector. And I put that in quotations because remember there's that space in between the axon terminal and its effector, and we call that the synapse. All right? So we can see how one of these is really directional while the other is sort of just dumped into the blood until it finds its right receptor. Okay? What about speed? Or the speed of the transmission? Okay. With the endocrine system, it's relatively slow. So it takes a while to find that right receptor. With the nervous system, it's fast. Here's a little fact for you that the action potential is actually about 268 miles per hour. That's pretty fast. Much faster than the endocrine system. All right, so what about the effect? The effect duration. So how long does it last? Well, the endocrine system is relatively long-lasting. Once it finds its right receptor, its effect is relatively long. With the nervous system, we said that speed was fast. It gets there quick. But how long does it last? It's a relatively short or quick duration. Okay. One more. Let's do one more here. And we'll do the intensity of the effect. So how do we increase the intensity of the effect? With the endocrine system, what we need is actually more hormone. So we need to increase the amount of hormone to increase the intensity. With the nervous system, we have to increase the number of action potentials. Okay, so that gives us a good comparison between the endocrine and the nervous system. All right, so keep these in mind as we move along. All right, so let's talk about hormones. What is a hormone? We need a good definition for that. Well, a hormone is, like we said, a chemical. It's a chemical message that is dumped where? Into the blood. But from there, it acts on a distant target. Okay, that's a good solid definition of a hormone. We have different types. Not all of these are actually dumped in the blood, and we call those either paracrine or autocrine. Okay, para meaning nearby or around, so it's going to act on a neighboring cell. So it acts on a neighboring cell. The autocrine, auto meaning self, so it's going to act on itself. Those are good definitions to keep in mind. So let's draw a picture of a blood vessel here. Okay, and let's say we have a hormone made somewhere and it is dumped into the blood. So these little squares will represent our hormone dumped into the blood. If I draw a cell down here, here's another cell, the nucleus, all right, and the hormone is traveling along in the blood and it comes upon a cell with its appropriate receptor, its matching receptor. So there we go. The hormone's found its receptor. It's caused something to happen within the cell. All right, and then we get some sort of action. What action that is depends on the hormone. All right, so what about this cell next to it? What if it had a receptor like that? Nope. that doesn't match. All right, so again, keep in mind it has to have the correct receptor for that hormone. All right, let's see. I wanted to draw you a picture of, say, a neuron. Okay, so let's say the action potential is traveling down the neuron, and once it gets to the terminal, it's going to release a neurotransmitter. Okay. So here's its effector cell, and then we'll draw another one down here. It's only going to work on the one it is touching. Remember, this space right here is called the synapse. So what about this guy down here? Let's say it has a receptor like that. All right, or maybe even it doesn't matter. Maybe it's the correct receptor, but the fact that it's not working is due to the fact that we do not have touching the axon terminal to that cell or that effector. Okay. Now we need to talk about the types of hormones. And there are three basic types: steroid hormones, which we're going to talk about first. Then we'll talk about amino acid derivatives, and then also peptide hormones. All right, so steroid hormones. Sorry about that. There we go. So steroid hormones. Steroid hormones, they typically end in sterone. So if you're thinking about steroids, you might think of testosterone, the one that people take whenever they're doing bodybuilding to get really big. So most of these steroid hormones end in sterone. There is an exception, and that's cortisol. It's classified as a steroid hormone, but does not end in sterone. Most of these steroid hormones are made or derived from cholesterol. Okay, so most of these are made or derived from cholesterol, which is a lipid. Okay, so it is a lipid, and it's also hydrophobic. It's going to give us a clue about its mechanism of action. So it's hydrophobic, meaning it does not like water. Okay, so let's draw a picture of a blood vessel here. All right, and let's say this is the hormone that was dumped into the blood, and it's a steroid hormone. We know it does not like water, so it needs a little bit of help, because if you remember, the majority of your blood is made up of water. So it's not going to fare well unless it has a little bit of help when traveling in the blood. And we call those little boats that I've drawn there carriers. Okay, so here is our target cell. So what we're concerned with here, here's my nucleus, nucleolus. What we're concerned with here is where the receptors are located for a steroid hormone. So sometimes we have receptors on the plasma membrane, maybe within the cell, and then other ones we have in the nucleus. With steroid hormones, once they find their target cell, they like the receptors in the nucleus. And if you're remembering what the nucleus does, it makes proteins. So a hormone binding to the nucleus is going to increase protein synthesis. And then that protein made, or that product, will of course cause some sort of action, right? But the thing you need to take home from this is that the receptors for steroid hormones are located within the nucleus. So where do we find these guys? We find them in the gonads, so the testes and ovaries. And we're going to get things like testosterone, progesterone, estrogen. We also find them in the adrenals. The adrenal glands located on the top poles of the kidneys. Okay. Mechanism is slow, and it's also one hormone for every one product. So the ratio is a 1-to-1 hormone to product ratio. Okay, so why is there Why does it have no problem getting in within the cell into the nucleus? It's the fact that it is hydrophobic and a lipid. So if you remember, what is the membrane of a cell made up of? Phospholipids. All right, so let's talk about the next one. All right, so our next one, so amino acid derivative hormone. So they have mechanisms that are similar to steroids, and they also have mechanisms that are similar to peptides, which we'll talk about next. So we split these guys up into two primary amino acid derivatives. Okay. The first one we're going to talk about is tryptophan. All right, so tryptophan can then break down into either serotonin or melatonin. Okay, so serotonin, it has a dual function. It's not only a hormone, but it's also a neurotransmitter. So we call that a neurohormone. Okay. Melatonin, remember, is made in the pineal gland in the epithalamus of the brain and helps to regulate our sleep cycles, our circadian rhythm. So you might recognize this word tryptophan. They say that turkey has a lot of tryptophan, when in all reality, chicken actually has more tryptophan in it than turkey. All right, so that is one of the primary amino acid derivatives. Let's look at the next one, and that's tyrosine. All right, so tyrosine is our second primary amino acid derivative. So those get broken down into catecholamines and then thyroid hormone. Let's talk about catecholamines first. Catecholamines, these guys are your dopamine, your epinephrine for adrenaline, and also norepinephrine. Okay, so norepinephrine. These guys are also neurohormones, meaning they have a dual function. They serve not only as hormones, but also as neurotransmitters. Their mechanism of action, it's faster than steroids, so they are like peptides, which we'll talk about next. So their mechanism is like peptides. They're fast, right? We don't want to wait for our epinephrine, our fight, whenever we're in our flight or fight response, whenever we're running from that bear, we don't want to wait for our epinephrine. We want it fast. Okay, so the thyroid hormone. We have two types. We have thyroxine, also known as T4. So you must know both names, thyroxine and T4. T4 stands for tetrahydrothymine. That's T4. So you must know both names. That tetra is in reference to how many iodines are binded to the chemical structure. The other one is T3, or triiodothyronine. Their mechanism of action is like that of steroids. So they're like steroids. They're slower than the catecholamines. What do I mean by their mechanism of action? So really what that means is where their receptors are located in the cells. Okay. So remember, with steroids, the receptors are within the nucleus. Okay. All right. So we just talked about two primary amino acids, tryptophan and tyrosine. Know which ones come off of each of those primary amino acids, and then also their mechanism of action. All right, so let's talk about the final and last one, the peptide hormones. Peptide hormones. Peptide hormones, they're hydrophilic, meaning they like water. They're also made, like the name indicates, from proteins. Their mechanism of action is much faster than steroids, and we're going to take a look at that now. So let me draw a blood vessel, and then we need a receptor cell or target cell. So here's the nucleus. So here's our hormone that was dumped into the blood. Okay. Here's another one. I'm going to draw a carrier on this one because with peptide hormones, they don't need a carrier, but some have a carrier. Okay, so where are their receptors located? Well, on the cell membrane. And once that hormone finds the right receptor on the cell membrane, it initiates a change, which the delta symbol, the triangle is the delta symbol for change. It initiates a change in receptor shape. And that starts off the process in the cell. It causes a chemical cascade, and it's a cascade of events. So one thing happens after another, after another, after another, one causing the other. And eventually, it causes the activation of a second messenger called cyclic AMP, or cyclic adenosine monophosphate. And that's a high energy molecule. So this is a second messenger. And that second messenger then goes and finds an enzyme. So here's our little Pac-Man enzyme. And when it finds its enzyme, it causes or it activates that enzyme. And then from there, we get some sort of other action. All right. So it could speed up a chemical process or whatever. But what's really cool about this is that this signal can be amplified. I'll show you what I mean by that. So our mechanism of action was to initiate, that stimulus initiates a second messenger response. Okay? And that response, which was activating an enzyme, can be amplified. So how is it amplified? Well, this cyclic AMP, this high energy molecule, the second messenger, is reusable, right? So it's not one hormone for every enzyme. That cyclic AMP can then activate, say, 1,000 enzymes, right? So that's what makes this mechanism fast. Its signal can be amplified because that cyclic AMP is reusable and can then in turn activate, say, 1,000 enzymes. Okay, let's look at some of the brain. And it produces releasing hormones, which then go and act on the pituitary gland. All right, those neurons in the hypothalamus have tracks that go down into the pituitary gland. Let's see if I can draw you a simple picture here. So here's our hypothalamus in the brain. Here's our posterior pituitary gland, and then our anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so this is the hypothalamus. This is post-pit or posterior pituitary, and this is anterior. We said the hypothalamus makes about 6 releasing hormones that I'm asking you to know, and then they're sent down specifically into the anterior pituitary to cause some sort of other action. The anterior pituitary is actually endocrine tissue, and we call that the adeno hypophysis. It's actual endocrine tissue. The posterior pituitary is an extension of the hypothalamus and is actually neural tissue, and we call that the neurohypophysis. You must know both names. So if we draw some neural tracks, we'll start off with the posterior pituitary that extend down into the posterior pituitary. What's interesting here is that the hormones made in the hypothalamus that go to the posterior pituitary are then just stored there. And that's oxytocin and vasopressin, or ADH. They're made in the hypothalamus and then stored in the posterior pituitary until they are needed. The anterior pituitary is actual endocrine tissue, so it's going to actually make some hormones. Releasing hormones from the hypothalamus go then into the posterior pituitary and find its correct receptors on those cells to make another hormone. There's a portal system within here. So here's a bed of capillaries in which those hormones go through. But what's different here is that they're connected to another set of capillaries. So capillaries in sequence we call a portal system. All right, and what it does here is that these hormones that are dumped into the blood from the hypothalamus want to stay in that local region. And so they're going through this portal system to get directly to the anterior pituitary. So let's talk about these releasing hormones. The first one is TRH. I'm not going to write all of these out. TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone, goes to the anterior pituitary to make TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin. The next one is corticotropin releasing hormone. Then it goes to the anterior pituitary to make adrenocorticotropin. Okay? Adrenocorticotropin. We can sort of guess where that's going to go, what its target would be, of course, the adrenals. The next one is growth hormone releasing hormone. It goes from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary to make growth hormone. Then we have gonadotropin releasing hormone. That goes from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary to make luteinizing hormone and FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So remember that sometimes these names give us hints about their targets. With this one, it's the gonads, the ovaries, and the testes. Then we have somatostatin. So somatostatin is a little bit different. It's not really a releasing hormone. It's an inhibitory hormone. It goes to inhibit growth hormone releasing hormone and then TRH. So it's an inhibitory hormone. It inhibits. We have another one of those, and that's dopamine. Dopamine goes to inhibit prolactin, the PRL, prolactin. All right, so keep those in mind. And now we're going to talk about, or just do an overview of endocrine glands and tissue. So now what I want to do is just sort of briefly go over the difference between true endocrine glands and endocrine cells or tissue. So I'll draw a line down the middle here. And we'll have true endocrine glands. And then we'll have just endocrine cells or tissue. Okay, what I mean by that is that a true endocrine gland, its sole purpose is devoted to, say, making hormones. Whereas when an organ has other functions besides endocrine and just only has cells or tissue, it's not a true endocrine gland. So let's list our true endocrine glands first. We have the hypothalamus, which we just talked about, the pituitary, the adrenals, which are found on the top poles of the kidneys, the pineal gland, which makes melatonin, the thyroid, and then the parathyroid, which are 3 to 4 seed-like glands on the posterior side of the thyroid. Parathyroid makes parathyroid hormone, which then travels to the kidney to make vitamin D. which then goes to increase calcium absorption. Okay, calcium absorption. So what are our organs that have some endocrine cells or tissue, but also other functions? So we'll start at the top. We have the thymus, which is a glandular structure that's located anterior superior to the heart. It has an immune function and it has cells that produce a hormone called thymosin, which also does have some immune function. It actually shrinks or atrophies as we age. Another one would be the kidney. The kidney makes hormone called erythropoietin, which we'll talk about. EPO is erythropoietin. It increases red blood cells. The pancreas. The pancreas actually, it's 99% exocrine, and it produces digestive juices that are pushed into the digestive tract, which actually help to digest and break down our food. That means that only 1% is actually endocrine, and those hormones that it makes are insulin, made by the beta cells in the pancreatic islets, and then glucagon, made by the alpha cells in the pancreatic islets. The heart also has some endocrine function. It produces natriuretic peptide, which helps to regulate blood pressure. It also makes atriopeptin, which decreases blood pressure. Your digestive system, including your stomach, makes certain hormones like gastrin. There are other ones, many other ones. The gonads. So your testes and ovaries, they make testosterone, and inhibin, which are androgens. Your ovaries make estrogen and progesterone. They also make inhibin. Okay, I think I've touched on all of those. So now I want to go back to that pathway we talked about in the very beginning. So we started off with the stimulus for the nervous system pathway. We'll do nervous system on this side and endocrine system on that side. So our stimulus, it was received by a sensory receptor and taken down the afferent pathway or sensory pathway to an integrator or the control center. That information is processed and sent down the efferent pathway or motor pathway to an effector, which could be another neuron or muscle cell. And that effector causes some sort of response. Okay, we're very comfortable with that. So now let's look at it from the endocrine side. So our stimulus is received, of course, by a sensor. But here our sensor is the integrator. So it is the integrator. So it's held all in one. Okay, so the endocrine gland or cell is both the sensor and the integrator. So our output signal, which would be the hormone, is dumped into the blood. So here's a little blood vessel and goes to, we could say, an effector, or in endocrine, we call it the target. And then that causes some sort of response. Okay, so if we look at this, the neural side, on the nervous system side, it's very directional. It's very one way and down the neuron, right? So on the endocrine side, it's not directional. It's dumped into the blood and travels there until it finds its target. Okay, so it's not directional on the endocrine side. All right, what's also cool about this is that you can stack these one on top of another. Okay, so if we did an example over here, we could do the hypothalamus is releasing TRH that goes to the anterior pituitary, which is one of these pathways on the endocrine side. And then the anterior pituitary releases, so if we're doing TRH, anterior pituitary would make then TSH. We could stack another one of these pathways underneath it, and the target for that would be the thyroid, which then would make thyroid hormone. So you can see how we can stack these pathways one on top of another. Okay. Now I want to talk about what stimulates a hormone. And there are three categories for that. The first one is humoral. So humoral, humor referring to body fluids, specifically the blood. Then we have neuronal, or the nervous system. And then the last one is hormonal, referring to hormones. Okay, so humoral, or in the blood, deals with different levels of things in the blood. So let's do an example here to sort of make this more clear. So our example will be calcium levels in the blood. So let's say calcium levels in the blood drop. Okay, that blood passes through the thyroid gland, and then it passes through the parathyroid glands. And when that blood is sensed in the parathyroid glands, it causes them to secrete parathyroid hormone. That parathyroid hormone, its target is bone cells. And then when it targets those bone cells, it causes a release of calcium that then gets dumped back into the blood. So this will increase calcium in the blood. Some up arrow. Okay, so let's do this again. So calcium levels in the blood were sensed to be low. So we're sensing something, our level in the blood. That blood circulates through the thyroid and then through the parathyroid glands. Whenever it's sensed in the parathyroid gland, it causes it to release parathyroid hormone, which then goes to bone cells, which are its target, and causes them to release calcium. And then that calcium gets dumped back into the blood, leveling out the once low levels of calcium. Okay, so what about neuronal stimulation, or through the nervous system? Well, it deals with nerve fibers that stimulate a hormone release. Okay, so let's say our stimulus here is fright. So we're frightened. Okay, what's going to happen is that our nervous system is initially going to sustain this fright, I guess. You could say that it's going to sustain this fright through the sympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic branch of the nervous system. And if you remember right, that during fright or flight, we release a hormone called epinephrine or norepinephrine. Okay, so that release of epinephrine is initiated first by the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, but it is sustained. Epinephrine and norepinephrine is sustained then from the adrenal glands. Okay, so that is neuronal stimulation. Okay, so what about hormonal stimulation? Basically what that means is when one hormone is released, it causes the release of another hormone. Okay, so when one hormone is released, it causes the release of another hormone. So let's do an example to sort of make that clear. We did this one earlier. So if we have the hypothalamus, and that hypothalamus releases the hormone TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, that releasing hormone travels to the anterior pituitary and tells those cells there to make TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. That thyroid stimulating hormone then travels in the blood to some distant target, which happens to be the thyroid gland, and tells those cells to make thyroid hormone. So hopefully that's clear to you that one hormone triggers the release of another hormone. So those are those different types of hormones, and you've probably again seen some of those questions on Learn Smart or on your practice quizzes. Okay, I have one more thing to show you and then we'll be done. There's a class of hormones that are not dumped into the blood. They're called eicosanoids. And when they're not dumped into the blood, we call those local hormones. This specific class are derived from arachidonic acid. Okay? So since they're local, we have names for that. So they're either autocrine, meaning they act on self, or paracrine, meaning they act on a neighboring cell. The majority of these eicosanoids are autocrine. So we have some examples of eicosanoids, and those are prostaglandins, thromboxanes, and leukotrienes. Especially prostaglandins are very powerful vasodilators, meaning they will increase the diameter of a blood vessel. So very powerful vasodilators. They will also act to inhibit platelet aggregation, which just means it keeps platelets from sticking together. And they also play a role in inflammation, or the inflammation process, or inflammatory process. Okay, so be aware of eicosanoids, what they are, where they're derived from, and then examples of those. Okay, so that concludes chapter 17, endocrine system. If you have any questions, please email me, and happy studying.